She had exactly 1 coin left in the world, and she pressed it into the beggar's cracked palm before she could talk herself out of it. He sat against the depot wall in Ferro Springs, hat gone to ruin, boots split at the toes, a bruise purpling one cheekbone as though the world had struck him and meant to strike again. The noon train had just groaned in with its cargo of dust and strangers, and the platform crowd stepped around him the way folks step around a puddle, careful not to look too long. Naomi Calder looked. She always looked. It was her late husband used to tease her, both her finest trait and the one most likely to leave her hungry. "You'll want this more than I will today," she said, closing his fingers over the coin before he could refuse it. It was her last dime, meant for a spool of thread she needed to mend the one good dress she had left. But a spool of thread could wait, and a man's stomach, she reasoned, generally could not. He looked up at her with eyes the pale grey blue of a winter sky, startled, as if kindness were a language he'd forgotten how to hear spoken. "Ma'am, I can't take a woman's last coin." "You can and you will, or you'll insult me twice in one afternoon, once by refusing my help and once by assuming I can't spare it." She said it lightly, the way she said most hard things, wrapping the truth in enough warmth that it wouldn't cut going down. In truth, she could not spare it. In truth, she had a note coming due at the Ferro Springs Trust that she had no notion how to pay, and a boarding house with 2 empty rooms and a roof that leaked over the good bed, and a grief for Thomas that she carried the way some women carried wedding rings, quietly, always. But none of that was this stranger's burden, and she had decided long ago that a person could be poor in coin and still rich enough to be kind. He closed his hand around the dime as though it were gold. "Then I thank you for the insult," he said, and something in his voice, low, dry-edged with a wit that didn't belong on a beggar's tongue, made her laugh before she meant to. "What's your name?" "Ira," he said after the smallest pause, as though deciding how much of himself to hand over along with it. "Ira Falk." "Naomi Calder," she said. "I keep the boarding house on Cutter Street, if you find yourself wanting a roof instead of that wall. I can't promise supper most nights, but I can promise the roof mostly." She smiled, bid him well, and went on toward the Mercantile with her now empty hand feeling strangely lighter than it had any right to, as if she'd set something down rather than given something away. She did not see him rise once she'd gone, nor watch him fold the dime into a coat pocket already heavy with a ledger of numbers that would have stopped her heart to see, nor hear him ask the station master, low and careful, whether anyone in this town knew the face of Ira Falk. The man who held paper on half the county and rail line besides. The station master did not. That was in fact the entire point of the ragged coat, and the split boots and the bruise he'd earned 2 towns back defending a different stranger's honor in a fight that hadn't been his business, but which he'd made his business anyway, because a man who owned that much of the territory had precious few honest ways left to learn what his money had actually built. He had come to Ferro Springs to look at a spur line, and a woman's face had undone the whole careful architecture of his disguise in under 2 minutes. Ira Falk stood at the depot rail long after she'd gone, turning the dime over in his fingers, thinking that he had bought and sold entire herds of cattle, whole stretches of grazing land, 3 hotels and a newspaper, and never once felt the particular, ringing weight of a coin that a woman could not afford to lose. That evening he presented himself at the boarding house on Cutter Street, and Naomi, who had spent the walk home rehearsing all the ways she would explain to herself why she'd have to turn away a paying guest if one appeared, because she had nothing to feed him, opened the door to find the beggar from the depot standing on her step with his hat in his hands. "I've got 2 bits and a willingness to chop wood," he said. "I understand that's the local currency." "It'll do," she said, and stood aside to let him in, telling herself it was Christian charity and nothing more, and knowing somewhere beneath her ribs that it was already something more. He proved a strange sort of guest. He ate what she gave him without complaint, though she caught him more than once studying the thinness of the stew, as though doing arithmetic he didn't like the answer to. He fixed the leak over the good bed with a scrap of tin and a patience that surprised her, working in the rain until his shirt stuck to his back, refusing the coffee she brought out twice before finally taking it and her in, with a look of such plain gratitude that she had to busy herself with the kettle to keep from staring. He asked questions in a way that felt less like idle talk and more like a man building something in his head, brick by careful brick, How long had she kept the house? What had the note been when Thomas took it out? Who held the paper now? What sort of man was Silas Vane? The sort who smiles while he ruins you, Naomi said, before she could stop herself, and then laughed at her own bitterness, because laughing was easier than the alternative. He's the trust's agent. He's given me until the 15th to make good on the balance, or the house goes up for the county to settle. I don't fault him the job. I fault him the smiling. Ira's jaw had gone tight in a way she didn't understand yet, a way that had nothing to do with beggary and everything to do with a man recalculating a debt he intended to collect on someone else's behalf. You'll make it, he said. Somehow women like you always do. Women like me generally don't, she said, not unkindly, just honest, the way the Depot son had been honest about the state of his boots. But I've got 11 days and a length of thread I still owe myself, so I suppose I'd best get started. He stayed on, not as a guest exactly. He would not let her call it that once his 2 bits ran out, but as a hand around the place, splitting wood, mending the porch step, walking her to the mercantile of an evening as though it were nothing at all, as though a poor widow's errands deserved an escort same as any fine lady's. Faro Springs began to talk, the way small towns do, though what they said was gentler than she expected, that the drifter had good manners for a drifter, that he looked at the widow Calder like a man looks at something he's afraid to want too plainly. He looked at her that way because it was true. Ira Falk, who had shaken hands with senators and buried 2 rivals in business dealings so thorough they'd never risen again, found himself utterly disarmed by a woman who darned his borrowed shirt by lamplight and hummed while she did it, who gave away her last coin and her last spare room and, it seemed, no small portion of her heart, all without once asking what a man had to offer before deciding he was worth the kindness. One evening on the porch, with the sky gone the color of a healing bruise, gold and violet both, she asked him plainly why a man with hands as careful as his had ended up begging at a depot. He almost told her then. The truth sat right behind his teeth. That he was Ira Falk of the Falkland and Rail Company, that he owned the very trust that held her note, that he had come to this town in rags, because a man surrounded by money his whole life eventually stops trusting anyone who smiles at him, and had wanted, just once, be looked at and helped for no reason but decency. But he was not ready to watch her face change the way faces always changed once they learned what he was worth. So he said only, bad luck and worse choices, and took her hand, just her hand, careful as a man handling something he intends to keep whole, and said, You're the first kindness I've been given in longer than I care to admit, Naomi Calder. I mean to repay it. You already have, she said, twice over, with all that wood you've split. But she did not pull her hand away, and something passed between them on that porch, quiet and certain as nightfall, that neither of them named aloud. 15th came grey and hard-edged. Naomi had scraped together a portion of the note, pennies from mending, a few dollars from a quilt sold to a rancher's wife, but nowhere near the whole of it, and she walked to the trust office with her chin up and her stomach in knots. Because a Calder did not hide from her debts even when her debts could not be paid. Silas Vane received her behind a desk polished bright enough to catch her reflection, his smile arranged like a man who has already counted his winnings. I did warn you, Mrs. Calder. The house reverts to the trust at noon, and I've a buyer already interested in the lot, intends to clear it for a freight yard. Nothing personal in it. He said it the way men say nothing personal when they mean every bit of it is personal, and enjoyed besides. She was still standing there. Dignity the only currency she had left to spend when the door opened and Ira Falk walked in, not in the rags she knew, but in a plain dark coat, clean-shaven, had set with the quiet authority of a man who had simply stopped bothering to hide. And behind him 2 men she recognized from the rail office, and a third she did not, carrying a leather case thick with paper. Mr. Vane, Ira said, and something in the way the whole room seemed to straighten at the sound of it told Naomi, in one dizzying instant, that the beggar who'd chopped her wood was no beggar at all. I own the trust that holds this note. I own the rail spur you mean to sell this lot to. And I own, as of an hour ago, your resignation, which you'll find on that desk once you've finished explaining to me why you tried to seize a widow's home 11 days after she paid down good faith on it, in a county where I happen to hold controlling interest in every institution you answer to. Vane's smile cracked clean through. He stammered something about procedure, about the letter of the note, but Ira only set the leather case on the desk and said, quiet and final, "The letter of the note is satisfied. I'm marking it paid in full, effective today, as a debt owed for a kindness I haven't finished thanking her for." He did not look at Vane when he said it. He looked at Naomi, and in his eyes was none of the beggar's careful hunger and all of a man who had, for the first time in longer than he could count, been seen and helped for no reason but decency, and had come at last to return the favor in the only currency Vaf to match it. Naomi's hand had gone to her mouth. Ira, she could not finish it. Half the territory. He owned half the territory, and he had split her wood in the rain and eaten her thin stew, and let her mend his shirt as though he owned nothing at all. "I should have told you," he said, when Vane had gone, scuttling white-faced into the street, and the office had emptied of everyone but the two of them, and the ticking of a clock too fine for the walls it hung on. "I meant to a dozen times over. I only wanted, once in my life, to be certain a woman's kindness was given to the man and not the money. You gave me your last coin before you knew I had 2 nickels to rub together, Naomi. Do you understand what that's worth to a man who's spent 20 years wondering if anyone would look at him twice without a ledger in the room?" "I understand," she said, and found she was laughing and crying both, "that you let me apologize for my thin stew." "Best stew I ever had," he said, and meant it, and crossed the small distance between them to take both her hands in his, careful as ever, as though she were still the only fortune in the room worth minding. "Marry me, Naomi Calder. Not because I can save the house, it's saved already, and would have been regardless. Marry me because you gave a stranger your last coin and asked for nothing back, and I have spent every day since trying to become a man worthy of standing beside that kind of heart." Outside, Ferro Springs went about its ordinary business, afternoon train sighing into depot, dust rising gold in the low sun, utterly unaware that the whole shape of a widow's life had just turned on its hinge. Naomi looked up at the man who had come to her as nothing and stayed as everything, and thought of the coin she'd given away without a second thought, and understood at last that some gifts returned to the giver 100-fold, dressed in old boots and a borrowed name, asking only to be loved for exactly what he was. "Yes," she said, and meant every certain, unhesitating syllable of it, and Ira Fork, magnate, landowner, and once, briefly, the most grateful beggar in the territory, bent his head to hers as though he had been waiting his whole wealthy, lonesome life for a woman poor enough in coin and rich enough in heart to finally make him feel like he was worth keeping.